I'm a faithful, believing Christian, and I definitely believe the Bible's true, and I want to figure out what it's trying to say. But when I'm looking at the resurrection narrative, sometimes they don't quite seem to fit together. What am I supposed to do with that? Hello, welcome to Ithaca, New Mexico, where we look at the show where we look at questions of wonder from the perspectives of both faith and reason, philosophy and theology. I'm your host, Daniel Kelly, and today we have a really fun episode, one that I really enjoyed working on, and it comes from a supporter request. So my supporters on Locals, they can request that I look at different various topics, and this is one that came up and I was like, oh, that's really cool, I want to look at that. Today, what I was asked to look at and what we'll be examining is the resurrection narratives, because if you're a Catholic, you know it's still Easter season, so we're still celebrating Jesus' resurrection. He hung out with the apostles for 40 days after he was raised, and remember that'll become important later. But he hung out with, and so Catholics celebrate Easter for all that we like to do what the apostles did, and Jesus hung out with them for 4 days after his resurrection. We celebrate Easter not just one day, but for 50 days actually. And we might get into that, why we do that in a different episode. But so specifically, I was asked to examine, well, when we look at Luke's gospel, that's where we get a lot of these cool resurrection narratives. How does the timeline, what's going on there? So we're going to be looking at Luke specifically, which I like, because sometimes when we mesh all of them together, which is good, there's good things about putting them all together, reading them as a whole, and you'll see that, but sometimes we miss what this specific author is trying to do. So we always have to look at the Word of God as a whole, but also see what specifically each author is saying. So we're not going to look at and compare to the other Gospels too much in this video. So one big problem that I think gets us confused when we're reading the Gospel narratives is we're trying to fit these narratives and what God's trying to tell us into our preconceived notions. And so that's when it brings us up short, right? And it's good for us. And that's why God wants us to kind of wrestle with Scripture in that way. So I'm going to go over some rhetorical devices that ancient authors would use very, very often that we're not familiar with, and sometimes confuse us when we're trying to look at the gospel narratives and we're trying to fit them into this very often we want this literalistic kind of history that we're used to today, but that's not, they did history while still being true to the facts, and we'll talk that in a slightly different way of curating the facts. So I'm borrowing a lot of this information from others, and I'll put a lot of resources for you in the links to those in the description, especially from Jimmy Akin. He's extremely intelligent Catholic apologist. This is not an apologetic video. If I wanted to defend this against other people, I'd say different stuff. But he's a really good apologist, probably one of the smartest guys alive. I'm going to put links to a lot of his work that he's done in this area in the description. But just a fair warning, when you're reading him or watching him, sometimes he can seem I like to say he's Christ's skeptic, right? Sometimes he can have this very acrid gaze, kind of like the gaze on the Pilgrim's Regress of the giant that just pierced through everything. Sometimes he can come across like that. So if you're reading that and you're kind of disturbed by that, don't worry. He is a good Catholic, a good Christian. He's just uses a very skeptical glance sometimes, which is good for us to have that sometimes. Getting back to the issue at hand, we're looking at Luke's Gospel and the resurrection narratives. So there's 4 tools that we can look at for examining how ancient authors would do history. One is selection. Okay, they've got a bunch of facts. Which ones am I going to actually put in? So we know from John's Gospel chapter 21, verse 25, that you couldn't write all the books that would need to be written if you're trying to put down everything that Jesus said or did. And even every important thing we know, because everything Jesus said or did was for our salvation and was important. So you have to select, okay, I'm going to select, and the different gospel writers selected different things. That doesn't mean they're contradictory, it's just they're selecting different things. Another thing that of course ancient authors did is paraphrase a lot, because They didn't have cameras, they didn't have photos, they didn't have TV recorders. So you have to, when you're doing a biography or something in your ancient writer, you have to try to get across the gist of what the person said, not necessarily word for word verbatim what they said. And we see this in Jesus would teach the same things a lot in memorable form, parables or stories and stuff, just to aid with this memorization. A lot of teachers would do that, a lot of rabbis and stuff. So selection, paraphrase, then sequencing, something we do some in modern historical biographies, but not as much. But this was very popular in the ancient world, where, yeah, sometimes I'm gonna arrange things in chronological order, and that's good. But a lot of times, if I'm describing someone's life, I'm gonna put it in topical order, okay? So the famous example of this that we can look at is Suetonius lists Caligula, you know, that crazy emperor. He puts his princely deeds all together, and then he puts his horrific deeds all together, right? And so a lot of ancient authors would do that, and definitely the writers of the Gospels would put, okay, Jesus did this, he's teaching on this topic, put it all together, and he's teaching on this topic, put it all together. They're not trying to assert, and that's very important, they're not trying to say all this happened on the same day or anything. Another thing that we find very often that confuses us sometimes is a technique known as telescoping. You have to fit everything. They didn't have books. So you're writing on a scroll that was handmade, right? So you're trying to fit everything on this scroll, and so sometimes you telescope everything together. What do I mean? For example, if I say something like Solomon built the temple, this is an example that different apologist, Trent Horn, likes to use. That doesn't mean Solomon literally picked up a hammer, and you're not going into all the details and stuff, but Solomon was behind everything that's going on with building the temple, and you can just say Solomon built the temple. Okay, so we've got selection, paraphrase, sequencing, and telescoping. Okay, so now let's look at who Luke is, because whenever you're looking at a narrative, you want to understand who's the person writing this. So Luke, image that I like to use is he was kind of like a private detective. He was going around figuring out, he's going, getting people witnesses, interviewing them, doing that kind of stuff. So he's very investigative, and he's very, you get a lot of really cool details from him. A very, very accurate historical document. He gets right very obscure titles for different regional governors that most people wouldn't even know, most Romans wouldn't even know. He gets those right. He gets the travel distances for walking in Acts exactly right. So he was on a lot of these, probably writing in a diary, or one of his sources were, so they knew exactly how many days walking it would take. So he's really, really good, really accurate. He uses lots of sources, right? So we know he was with Paul, where scholars pretty much agree he probably used Mark as one of his sources, the Gospel of Mark, which Mark's a different subject. He might not have been writing a book. It could have been just notes, but we'll talk about for other people to write books like Luke, but we could talk about that examining Mark later. And we probably, there's evidence, and most, at least Catholic scholars would agree, that Mary probably, or someone close to Mary, that she had told things to, but probably Mary herself was one of Luke's sources. Okay, so in Luke's resurrection narratives, we see that he's using selection, definitely. He has to, we know and this is going to be important later, he has this whole big body of what he could include, but he can't include it all, so he's picking some. And he's definitely going to be using sequencing, putting everything together, resurrection narratives, even if they didn't all happen on the same day, right? Because we know in Acts, he says, and Luke wrote Acts 2, that Jesus appeared for 40 days, and he was doing stuff for those 40 days, right? So we don't have 40 days of narratives from Luke. He's just picking out the important parts. And why is he doing this? Because many scholars have noted this. Luke and Matthew, the Gospels of Luke and Matthew, fit exactly on the size of one scroll. Okay, so he has a limit. He has a word limit. He can't go over. So he has to use these techniques to fit everything onto one scroll. Matthew does the same thing. So Luke, when he thinks it's important in the resurrection narratives, is gonna give time markers, but at other times he's going to leave off time markers. So if he's like, no, this happened right the day he was resurrected, we're going to see those. We're going to see those time markers. But when it's not important, he's just going to leave it off and just present it as one seamless resurrection narrative. Okay, so now that we've got all that preliminary stuff out of the way, let's actually look at the resurrection narrative, how it actually all fits together in Luke. Well, it starts with, in Luke 24:21, the women leaving for the tomb. This is somewhere right around dawn. If we look at the other Gospels, we know it probably started before it was light, and they got there when it was light. He just says that it was in the morning, right? That's what he says. So we know, if we look at Matthew as a sideways thing, that the angels already had appeared and already had moved the stone away. That's very interesting, fitting Matthew into this, but we're not doing that today. But just so you know, the stone's already moved away, the angels are there. So they get there in verse 2, boom, the tomb's open, wow. And so at least Mary Magdalene, maybe the other women who are there, then go and tell Peter. This is in verse 9. So that's what's happening next. They see that it's empty, boom. They're like, who do we need to tell? Boom, Peter, because he's the leader of the church, even to this day. But that's a topic for another time. Peter comes and checks it out in verse 12 and then returns home. That's what's happening. So next, what happens is the women return from telling Peter and talk to the angel. This is verses 3 to 8. And you might say, hey, wait. It seems like you're doing stuff out of order there, because you're skipping around in the verses. So one of the reasons this is because Luke knew from his sources that all this stuff happened, but he didn't necessarily, and there's different theories, different ways we can put this together, but the one that I think is strong, that Luke knows that Peter went and did this, he just doesn't know when, so he just puts it in there, right? If we're going to look for a strict chronology of this part, I'm going to go with John's gospel, and that is what I'm doing, because John's much more concerned as an eyewitness, because he was an eyewitness, with the chronology. So the women return, they've told Peter, Peter's looked, and he's gone home, he's kind of perplexed, and then the women return, and that's where they're talking to the angel. And then in verse 9, we see that they're supposed to go and tell all the disciples. They go to tell them in verses 9, and then 9b to 11, they're telling them. Okay, sometime during all this stuff happening on, we don't know because it's never described in any of the Gospels, sometime Jesus appears to Peter during all this, right? This could be at the same time, because we know from from different parts of Luke's Gospel, different parts of 1 Corinthians, he has a special appearance to Peter, but we don't know where that happened. We don't have a description of it. So I'm going to place it here because it probably happened before the road to Emmaus, unless he's bilocating, which he could do. He could be two places at once with Emmaus. Then the next thing in chapter 24, verses 13 to 35, it's going to be the road to Emmaus, right? We know that story. That's what's happening. It's getting towards evening, okay? And he appears to Cleophas, and the whole, I could talk about the whole Cleophas thing. There's very interesting stuff in there, but we'll get to that later. And then it's Sunday night. So then he appears sometime during this Sunday night to the core disciples. So that's verses 36 to 43. It's after the Emmaus appearance. And we know from John, Luke doesn't put this because either he didn't know or he didn't especially think it was super important to put, and he's trying to fit to one scroll, that Thomas wasn't there, but the other core disciples are there, okay? And then we've got this big gap of stuff where Jesus is doing stuff during the 40 days that we don't know, right? Acts 1:3, Jesus appearing during the 40 days. And Luke doesn't record that, okay? All this stuff's happening, so he's giving them evangelistic instructions. He's appearing to the 500 brethren. He's appearing to James. He likely gave some of his instructions more than once. He went to Galilee. Luke completely takes out the Galilee narratives. Those are from the other Gospels because Luke is focused on John. Where is all this happening right now? It's in Jerusalem. But then, during these 40 days, and some people get confused because it's there's going to be, Luke is going to say, and then Jesus said this, and it's going to be the ascension, and they're like, oh, it all seems to be happening on the same day. But the word in Greek that they're using for then, that Luke could mean thereafter. It could mean then as in now, or then as in after this, in the future. So there's a lot of stuff that's going on here that Luke knows about, but he doesn't record, right? Because we know he knows about the Galilee appearances because he's using Mark as a source. But then some of the instructions that happen during these 4 days he records in verses 44 through 49, okay? So he's just giving them those instructions, and then he's back, they're back at Jerusalem after all this stuff has been happening. It's not immediately clear to the English reader that all this stuff has happened, that he's condensed it. And then he ascends into heaven. That's chapter 24, verses 50 through 53. And then again in Acts chapter 1, verses 6 through 11. So that's kind of the sequence that I hope has been very helpful to you to picture, oh, this is what Jesus is doing, and these are the times. So back to the overall picture, although these different traditions focus on different things, like Matthew's going to focus on the Galilee appearances, Luke's going to focus on the Jerusalem appearances and the resurrection. One thing that's really interesting, although they'll omit different parts because they're trying to fit to one scroll, they never resequence the time. The stuff always happens in the same chronological order. Yeah, so that's really good evidence. One thing, Luke is focusing on Jerusalem. There's many reasons for this that I'm not going to go into all, but one of the reasons, and this has been noted by many people, is because you see in the Gospel of Luke, there's kind of this, Jesus is at the peripheries. He goes from the peripheries, like with the Gentiles and stuff, to Galilee and then to Jerusalem. Right? And that's where all this happens. And Jerusalem's kind of the core place. But then in Acts, he knows the structure of Acts is going to be the reversal of all that. So it's going to start in Jerusalem, go to Galilee, and go out to all the world. Okay? You can see that in Acts. It actually says, you'll be my witnesses in Jerusalem and Galilee and the ends of the earth, right? We know that. So that's an interesting thing that you can look at. It gives a really easy way to remember Jesus' ministry and then the church's ministry. It parallels them, and it just gives a nice overall way for us to remember and picture stuff. So I hope this has been kind of helpful for you to picture the resurrection appearances, especially in Luke's gospel. Try to put together when everything's happening. I also want to encourage you to, if you want more videos like this, if you have an idea for a video or something you'd like me to examine, become a supporter and say, hey, I'd like you to do this or I'd like you to do that. Well, I hope you enjoyed this and you have a wonderful, blessed day. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Please hit the like button and drop a comment down below. If you really liked it, consider subscribing and hitting the bell notification so you never miss a video. If you want to help me produce more great videos just like this, please support me on Locals. There's a link in the description, and that you'll get all sorts of good benefits for being a part of our Locals community, and you'll help me produce these great videos. Thank you so much.